right. Welcome to our third video of week 2. This one is about the genres that were sort of in the margins during the period of the 40s and the 50s, and how they emerged and were identified by labels for marketing. So when we look at the overview for today's presentation, we want to look back at what we talked about with the emergence of the pop icon and how that has been developing over the last decades leading up to into the 1940s, and identify a sort of unifying cultural motif of hot jazz as it comes into fruition during this time period in the 1940s. It is we'll identify what that is and look at how it shows up in different kinds of genres, and then look at how what had been known as just hillbilly music, so basically the indigenous music of poor white folks, as opposed to the race records, which is the indigenous music of black folks during the time. How that marketplace splits up into various submarkets, and who some of the icons associated with those markets are. And then look at the, and so those are on the periphery, race records, hillbilly music, Mambo, Latin and Calypso music. So those are also emerging, especially in the 1950s. And then looking a little bit at blues music and how it is coalescing around certain types and styles and artists, and how it is suggesting a future development, not only in terms of the rise of the pop icon that we saw in T-Bone Walker, who was a blues artist. It's the first one to have an electric guitar and lead a backing band that consisted of, drums, bass, keyboard, and him on electric guitar. So looking at, that question there, we saw a little bit of, how Frank Sinatra, Nat King Cole, even Bing Crosby were some of the earliest pop icons, and we were able to verify that by looking at commercials that were satirizing that whole phenomenon. And so they were singers, though, right? And so they weren't even band leaders. Oftentimes they would be featured vocalists, and especially in the big band setting, that is, the band leader might be Glenn Miller, for example, is a trombone player, or you've got Stan Kenton, who is a piano player, and so they are really not the focal point. They're just the band leader. And so vocalists stepping into the spotlight, we talked about the importance of film, and the combination of sound and image. Vocalists start to emerge, obviously, and so when that vocalist becomes kind of empowered with the success as an instrumental soloist, now you've got sort of a double whammy. So that's what we find again with T-Bone Walker, and here's his first recording that kind of combines all those elements in 1941. I Got a Break, Baby, so you can listen to that. And so here's on the vocal side, and this is on the instrumental side down here. So in the 1920s, you can listen to these if you're into guitar. These are fantastic recordings, jaw-dropping when you think that they're in the 1920s. But you have these people who are prodigies on their instrument. And so the guitar wizard or guitar god or whatever you want to say is, this is an identity or category in the music business that's been under construction since at least the 1920s. And so that's another way to look at T-Bone. So he's getting the guitar, identity, as well as the singer identity, band leader, as well as composer, songwriter. And so the pop icon has all of these. And then the last question is, how do they look on camera, right? Because that's the last step in the puzzle usually. Now, behind this, so as you have a coalescing of ingredients that comes to inform, what the pipe icon is, You also have what's referred to as hot jazz as a cultural motif across multiple genres of music. So hot jazz is the intersection of up-tempo swing, so the fast swing that's super danceable, like Glenn Miller's In the Mood, for example, is a really good example. And you mix that in with blues and Boogie Woogie, for example. But the up-tempo version, now you have something that is very danceable, very infectious, and has this kind of earworm effect that is, stays in the memory and makes you want more. And so coming out, the Boogie Woogie, the main three boogie players of the World War II period, and that's the earliest, not the earliest period, but that is the period of its greatest visibility. The earliest boogie players were in the late 20s once again. So you've got like Clarence Pinetop Smith, for example, and that's him right there. Pinetop's Boogie Woogie was the first sort of hit for that style of piano. And so there's that sound of Boogie Woogie that's sort of becomes omnipresent in a lot of different genres. So you can hear it in the Western swing recordings, for example, of Bob Wills. You can hear it in some of the Chicago blues records of Big Bill Broonzy or Sonny Boy number 1 on the Bluebird label. And so they're doing basically a precursor to jump blues music. They're doing the earliest electrified blues. You got piano blues, Western swing, and then big band music, so big band swing. All have a recurrent sort of a way to refer back to. So it's a motif, right? So there you have the sound that's coming through on several successful recordings, and it becomes part of the sound of the 1940s, in fact. But the fact that it's unifying, like it's one musical idea, right? And that musical idea, I think I've showed you before how it goes. But it's based on the 1, 3, 5, 6 in dominant 7. And then you change the key to the F. And G, F, C. So that, when you do it in a syncopated way, add the right hand, right? You imagine that, I mean, that's already pretty catchy in terms of its rhythmic ideas, but then you start to add electric guitar and a bunch of, horn section, talented singers, and of course, the, beverage of your choice, since we are now out of prohibition. Things are getting late into the evening and, people are dancing suggestively. You can see that it's a pretty good mixture for a fun time. And that is regardless of skin color and music genre in the 1940s and 50s. So Western swing, some of these Latin bands, you can hear sort of the echo of the same musical motif that's going through. So this is an important thing to recognize in American music, is that there are, trendy sounds for sure, but they oftentimes can transcend these boundaries of genre, just like musical fellowship transcends boundaries of skin color for a lot of these musicians. And so that's an interesting dynamic when you look at the music business and its development. So on the side of, and certainly some of these artists also had that strain of sound coming through, but it was a lot less common. So on the side of, quote, hillbilly music, here you've got Earl Scruggs as a representative of a newer genre of music that had, fiddle, banjo, mandolin, and acoustic guitar as some of the primary instruments that were associated. And So you've got hillbilly music starting to diversify, and so bluegrass music kind of coming out of the Blue Ridge Mountain area, Shenandoah Valley, so East Coast mountain ranges, Kentucky for sure. And you can see also a dobro guitar back here. We talked about the metal body guitars. So this is an acoustic music form. Oftentimes, so Foggy Mountain Breakdown is a good example. We'll give just a quick listen here. All right, don't want to play too much of that. Get the man on my tail. And so hillbilly music is splitting, is splitting apart. Or perhaps all of these traditions were actually under development already. And so it's not the case that hillbilly music is splitting apart, but it's that the market, the value of the marketplace is demanding recognition at a finer level of resolution or detail. And so now, instead of saying, oh, that's just falls under this big umbrella term, now the record companies are realizing that if we recognize that Bob Wills as a Western swing artist is doing stuff that's different from Gene Autry as a country artist, or Jimmy Rogers as a folk artist, or Bill Monroe as a bluegrass artist, we can sell to all of these marketplaces individually. I think that looks probably a little bit better. And certainly make a little bit more money as a result. And so this is taking place across the 1940s. You're starting to get greater resolution. And by the time we get, it's actually taking place across the 1930s. By the time we get into the 40s, you can see that hillbilly music is now split off into, that's an antiquated term. And so you've got these genres that emerge from beneath there. The Mambo craze. So talking about other musical forms that are sort of emerging from the margins. Afro-Cuban culture is the source of this high energy musical form. Whether you find it in, sort of Calypso sources, all the way out to, Italian Mambo, as we'll see, to Cuban music, island music, Central American influences as a sort of Latin catch-all term that a lot of different kinds of music could come into. And so there was a reflection of this cultural diversity in the 1950s for the first time. Kind of like those of you who know, about French culture, they use the term chinoiserie, so Chineserie is how we would translate that, in the 1700s to refer to anything that is Oriental at all. So they have less concern about the different cultures embedded than they do that, hey, this is just from the East, right? And so the Mambo was kind of like that in the 1950s. There was less willingness to say, this is from X, Y, or Z island than it was, okay, this is sort of a Latin music influence. And you've got folks that are picking up on it from, the jump blues. So Louis Jordan, jump blues artist. From big band swing, Cab Calloway does the Conga Conga over here. And then you have more, I guess you could say, indigenous or authentic purveyors of the culture, like Perez Prado and Rene Hernandez with Mambo number 5, which is up here. Okay, so these are songs that are making their way into the mainstream via the big band movement and by artists like Louis Jordan and Cab Calloway, who are, willing to expand their repertoire to show their own diversity. And so it's interesting to see that, the avenues through which Mambo is making it onto the mainstream. Now, by the 1950s, it's verifiably a mainstream movement because you've got Rosemary Clooney here, and of course, the famous Clooney actor of today, George Clooney. So that's his mom. Was a singer in the 50s, and she's doing Mambo Italiano on film. And so this is a little excerpt of that. Okay, so another good indication that we are in fact dealing with, something very popular. The mainstreaming process, right? So it's coming in as an indigenous form, picked up by the big band swing artists, where it's exposed to a larger audience, and now Rosemary Clooney is basically inviting house moms, to think about how exotic it would be to go on a Italian vacation or something like that, right? And so I wouldn't be surprised to see an uptick in trips to Italy during the 1950s as a result of this. That's kind of how all of this tends to land, is appealing to the consumer imagination. So what we're seeing, in the 1950s, coming out of the 40s into the 50s, is that there's a lot of heterogeneity in terms of musical genre. And so heterogeneity means, as opposed to homogeneity. So heterogeneity is that you have more fluid borders, right? So it's not black and white. There's a lot of gray area in between. Things are sort of mixing. And so musicians are showing a desegregated picture, even in the face of conservative, American thought, seeing race mixing as a threat. So we talked about Artie Shaw hiring Billie Holiday, Benny Goodman hiring Charlie Christian, etc. And then, we've got genre mixing as well that is going on at the same time. So at the time that rock and roll is kind of in its infancy, or is, all the elements are present, I should say, there's also an interesting freedom of border when it comes to the recognition of different genres that are sprouting up, and people are trying them out that may not be from that genre. So Bill Haley, known, for Rock Around the Clock, early rock and roll artist, had a stint as a Western swing artist down here. Elvis doing Heartbreak Hotel. These are examples of songs that are on multiple charts at the same time. And so there's an interesting sort of dynamic of confluence of genre at the time that rock and roll is coming about. Now, one of the main genres to feed into early rock and roll was Chicago blues. And so, the main label there, we talked about Chess Records earlier, but they are one of the independent labels of the 1950s, or I guess we will talk about them next time. And they were known for, as one of the primary labels that took transplant, Mississippi or Delta, Southern blues, country blues artists, and got them playing through amplifiers, playing around Chicago, and the sound that resulted from that became known as Chicago blues. These two were also themselves immigrant brothers. There they are with Phil's son Marshall. Moved to Chicago in the late 20s, served in the Army, ran a nightclub. So they had, by the time the 50s or 40s came along, they had already been around for a couple of decades and knew which way the wind blew. And so, you've got Etta James as one of their artists there. So she's at the piano with Phil Chess, and then Phil Chess again on the right-hand side with Muddy Waters, Little Walter on harmonica, and Bo Diddley. So these guys were super instrumental in what we could call the codification of Chicago blues. So losing, in some cases losing instruments like mandolin or fiddle that would be in the old country blues tradition, and then replacing that with amplified guitar, amplified harmonica. You still have a stand-up bass, stand-up, acoustic piano, but you've got drums in there now. And so that sound became super iconic, and its distribution overseas led to bands like the Rolling Stones. I mean, you read the Rolling Stones biographies or interviews, and they talk about finding these old blues records in England. And so the song, Muddy Waters' song Rolling Stone, became the one that they chose for their own band. And of course, the Rolling Stones are now history. So this is Muddy Waters just a few years after he moved to Chicago in, I think, 47 from the Delta, from Clarksdale. And this is him, in the Delta. Here, I think probably 1943. You can see he's in the country blues kind of setting with the fiddle player, Son Sims. And then afterwards, here he is in 54 in the full Chicago blues setup, amplified harmonica, 2 guitar players that are amplified, piano player, etc. And so the sound that you're getting in that short amount of time is way different. See, that is much more modern, hard-hitting, and sort of has a urban sophistication about it that was completely captivating for the youngsters, like, the Beatles and the Stones, for example. And when they came over, in fact, to the United States, there's a apocryphal tale of Paul McCartney or the Beatles being interviewed, landing at JFK in New York City. And one of the reporters said, what do you want to see while you're in the United States? And McCartney says, Muddy Waters. And the reporter says, who is that? And McCartney says, don't you know who your own famous people are? Which is probably the best response of all times to that question. Because they had a view that was not filtered by the whitewashing machine of, what did we call it? When you've got different aspects of society subtly reinforcing the same messages. So I forgot the term I just used at the last class. You've got the press, so I can't. Oh my gosh. In any case, as outsiders, the Western Europeans that were coming to sort of participate in American musical culture were much more aware of the reality of it, I guess, than those to whom the records are being marketed. So those sort of indigenous American, the youth market. It took them a while to kind of peer behind the curtain and see where, Rock Around the Clock and stuff like that, those songs, Shake, Rattle, and Roll, really came from. So in any case, that is a look at some of the elements coalescing around the birth of rock and roll in the 1940s and 50s. And I will see you next time.